Today I have a story for you that honestly still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. This one was told to me by a girl I know personally, and she gave me permission to share it as long as I changed her name. So I will. But everything else, the details, the timeline, what happened, that's all real. At least, that's what she swears. And knowing her, I believe every word. This is one of those stories that reminds you why you should always trust your gut, even when your brain is telling you you're overreacting. Especially then. So this girl, I'm going to call her Sophie, she was in her mid-20s when this happened. She'd just gone through a breakup and quit her job within the same month, which, if you've ever had that kind of 1-2 punch in life, you know it puts you in a weird headspace. She wasn't depressed exactly, more like restless, like she needed to shake something off. She needed to get out of her apartment, out of her city, out of her routine. She needed something that felt like a reset. Sophie had always been drawn to nature, but in a careful way. She wasn't the type to grab a tent and disappear into the backcountry. She liked the idea of being surrounded by trees and open sky, but she also liked the idea of having walls around her if things got uncomfortable. So she came up with this plan to rent a camper van and drive north, up into the national forests, where there was free public land you could camp on for nothing. The van felt like a perfect compromise. She'd be out in the wilderness, but she'd also be inside a locked metal box with an engine that could take her away at any moment. It felt safe. It felt manageable. At least, that's what she thought. She told me she spent a few days just driving, staying at truck stops overnight, and moving on in the morning. She was looking for that perfect first campsite. You know, somewhere beautiful and remote, but not too remote. She had this app on her phone that showed campsites other people had used before, little pins on a map with reviews and photos. She had about 5 or 6 of them marked along this one stretch of road that cut deep into the forest. Miles and miles of public land in every direction with nothing else around. That was supposed to be the area. That was where she was going to have her first real night in the wild. But what she didn't expect was that none of the campsites existed, or at least she couldn't find them. Every time she'd reach one of the marked spots on her GPS, there'd be nothing there. No trail, no clearing, no sign that anyone had ever camped there. Just dense forest pressing right up against the edge of the road. She drove for over an hour on this rough, unpaved road, bouncing over rocks and ruts, checking spot after spot and finding nothing every single time. And the further she drove, the more anxious she got. The sun was dropping fast, painting the sky in those deep oranges and purples that look gorgeous, but really just mean you're running out of time. And she knew once it was fully dark, she'd have zero chance of spotting any kind of trail or turnoff. To make things worse, her phone had lost signal about 40 minutes back, so she couldn't even open the app to search for new sites. She would have had to drive all the way back to where she'd started just to get service. And even then, there was no guarantee the next batch of campsites would be any more real than the first ones. She was stuck, frustrated, tired from hours of driving on terrible roads, and the forest around her was getting darker by the minute. The trees up here were different from what she was used to. Tall pines, packed tight together, their trunks straight and dark like columns in some ancient hall that went on forever. The canopy overhead was so dense that even before sunset, the road was already sitting in deep shadow. And it was quiet, in a way that felt unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of gravel under the tires and the low hum of the engine. Sophie said it felt like driving into a place that didn't want her there, like the forest had closed behind her and the road ahead was just getting swallowed up, meter by meter, into the dark. She was about to give up and start the long drive back when her headlights caught something off to the left. A narrow path, barely visible, cutting away from the main road and disappearing between the trees. She almost missed it. If she'd been going any faster, or if the light had been hitting at a slightly different angle, she would have driven right past it. But she saw it, and she stopped. It wasn't on her map. It wasn't one of the marked campsites. It was just a trail, barely wide enough for the van, leading into the forest. She sat there for a minute with the engine idling, staring down that path. The headlights only reached about 20 meters before the trees swallowed the light completely. Beyond that, nothing. Just black. Every reasonable part of her brain said to keep driving, to go back, to find a truck stop and try again tomorrow. But she was so frustrated and so tired of searching that she talked herself into it. She told herself this had to be a campsite. It was on the same road as all the others. Someone had clearly driven down here before. There were faint tire marks in the dirt. It would be fine. She'd just pull in, park for the night, and figure things out in the morning. She turned the wheel and pulled onto the trail. The van rocked and bounced as it crept down the narrow path. Branches scraped along the sides, a horrible screeching sound that set her teeth on edge. The headlights swept back and forth across the trees as the trail curved, throwing wild shadows that jumped and twisted like living things. It went on for maybe 5 minutes, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're alone in a van on a trail you've never seen before in total darkness, 5 minutes feels like an hour. And then the trail ended. Just stopped. She pulled into a tiny clearing, barely large enough for the van to fit. There was no loop to turn around in, no branching paths leading to other campsites, no fire ring, no signs, no evidence that this was any kind of designated camping area. It was just a dead end in the middle of the forest. Her van, a small patch of dirt, and trees in every direction, pressing in close like walls. Sophie sat in the driver's seat for a long time after she stopped. She didn't turn off the engine right away. She just sat there, hands on the wheel, looking out through the windshield at the wall of trees in front of her. The headlights made the nearest trunks glow pale white, but everything beyond them was pure darkness. And in that darkness, the branches up in the canopy were moving. Not swaying like in a breeze. There was no breeze. Just this slow, random shifting, like the trees were adjusting themselves, settling, getting comfortable around her, the way a predator curls around something it's caught. She told me that sitting there, she felt something she'd never felt before. Not fear, exactly. Something deeper. A wrongness. Like her body was picking up on something her eyes couldn't see and her ears couldn't hear. A signal from somewhere ancient in her brain that said this place is not safe and you should not be here. She described it as a feeling of being watched, but not by anything specific. More like the whole forest had become aware of her, like she'd stepped into something's territory and it had noticed. But she was exhausted and frustrated, and she told herself she was being ridiculous. First time in the wilderness, of course you're going to be nervous. Of course everything is going to feel creepy. That's just what the woods are like at night when you're not used to them. She turned off the engine. She turned off the headlights. And for a moment, the darkness was so complete and so sudden that she couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. She sat there in the pitch black for maybe 10 seconds before her eyes started to adjust. Then she climbed into the back of the van, turned on the small interior light, and tried to settle in. She changed into comfortable clothes, laid out her sleeping bag on the little mattress, and told herself she'd feel better in the morning. She'd wake up, see the forest in daylight, and laugh at herself for being so spooked. That was the plan. She'd been lying on the bed for maybe 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence outside, when she heard it. Footsteps, crunching on the dirt and leaves right outside the van. They were close, not approaching from a distance, already there, like someone had been standing nearby and had just started moving. Sophie froze, her whole body locked up, She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, and listened. The steps were slow and deliberate, not the careless crunch of an animal moving through brush. These were human footsteps, measured, controlled, moving along the side of the van toward the front. And then, before she could even sit up, there was a knock on the driver's side window. 3 hard knocks. Confident. Like someone knocking on a front door in the middle of the day, not on a van window in the dead of night in the middle of a forest where no one should be. Sophie's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She got up slowly and moved to the front of the van, crouching down to peer through the driver's window. And there was a man standing right outside, barely a foot from the glass, looking in at her. He was maybe in his 40s, hard to tell in the dim light. Average build, average height, normal clothes, nothing that screamed danger. He gave her this smile when she appeared at the window, but it was wrong. It was one of those smiles that's supposed to look friendly, but doesn't quite make it. Too quick, too tight, like he'd put it on the way you'd put on a hat, something to wear rather than something to feel. His eyes didn't match the smile at all. They were darting, restless, looking past her, over her shoulder, into the back of the van, like he was checking to see if there was anyone else inside. Sophie cracked the window just enough to hear him. He said his name was Marcus, said he was camping nearby and just wanted to say hello to his neighbor before it got too late. His voice was friendly enough, but there was this edge to it, this tightness, like he was working very hard to sound casual and not quite pulling it off. Sophie told me 3 things hit her immediately. 1, she had no idea where this guy was supposedly camping. She hadn't seen another vehicle, or another clearing, or any sign of human presence anywhere on the drive-in. 2, he said he wanted to stop by before it got too dark, but it had been fully dark for at least half an hour. The sun had been down long before she even found this trail. And 3, and this was the one that really got under her skin, his eyes would not stop moving. Every few seconds, they'd flick past her into the back of the van, like he was expecting to see someone else, like he was hoping she was alone, but needed to confirm it. She thanked him for stopping by, kept her voice steady, kept it polite, but made it clear the conversation was over. She started to lean back from the window, and the man didn't move, didn't step back, didn't wave goodbye. He just stood there, feet planted, watching her retreat into the van, with that wrong smile still hanging on his face. Sophie pulled the curtain across the front cabin and moved to the back. She waited maybe 15 seconds, then carefully pulled aside the small curtain on one of the side windows and looked out. He was gone. Not walking away, not visible heading back down the trail. Just gone, like he'd been erased. She moved to every window in the van, one by one, pressing her face close to the glass and scanning the darkness outside. If this guy had a campsite nearby, there would be a light somewhere. A lantern, a flashlight, a headlamp, something. Nobody walks through a pitch-black forest without some kind of light. But there was nothing. Every direction she looked, just black trees and black sky and silence. No footsteps fading into the distance. No rustle of someone walking through underbrush. The forest was exactly as quiet as it had been before he appeared, which made no sense, because he had to have gone somewhere. Sophie spent the next 20 minutes circling the inside of the van, checking every window, looking for any sign of the man or his campsite, or any indication of where he'd come from or where he'd gone. Nothing. Not a trace. And the longer she looked without finding anything, the worse she felt. Because if he wasn't camping nearby, then where had he come from? And if he'd walked back down the trail, she would have heard him. The forest was dead silent. She would have heard footsteps on gravel for at least a minute. But there had been nothing. No sound at all. Which meant he hadn't left. That realization hit her like ice water. He was still out there, somewhere in the darkness just beyond her windows, standing, waiting. Doing what, she had no idea, but he hadn't left. She knew she should drive away. Every part of her was screaming to get behind the wheel and go. But another part of her, the part that needed to understand, that couldn't stand not knowing, made her do something she still regrets. She went to the front of the van, opened the driver's door, and stepped outside. The darkness wrapped around her instantly. It was so thick, she could feel it on her skin, like humidity, like something with weight and texture. The air was cold and completely still, not a breath of wind. The trees stood around her like silent figures, their trunks barely visible in the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy. And above, the branches were doing that slow, unsettling movement again, shifting, creaking softly, although there was nothing moving them. Sophie stood by the van and turned slowly, scanning the tree line in every direction. She could see maybe 5 meters before the forest became a solid wall of black. She listened. Nothing. Total silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of the blood moving through your own head. And then she felt it. Not heard it. Felt it. A presence. Behind her. Close behind her. That animal instinct that tells you something is there before your senses confirm it. The hair on the back of her neck stood straight up. There was a short shuffling sound from directly behind the van. She moved quickly to the other side, circling the vehicle, her eyes straining against the darkness. Nothing. She couldn't see anything, but the sound had been right there, right behind her, not 10 meters away, not 5. Right there. And then, without really knowing why, she dropped to her knees and looked under the van. 2 eyes stared back at her. The man was lying flat on the ground under her van, pressed against the dirt, looking directly at her from less than a meter away. His face was half in shadow, but she could see his eyes clearly. They were wide open, unblinking, locked onto hers with an intensity that was not human in the way it felt. Not angry, not scared, not anything she could name, just fixed on her, like a predator frozen in the moment before it strikes. Sophie told me she doesn't remember getting up, doesn't remember the scream. She just remembers being inside the van suddenly, slamming the door, hitting the lock, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the key. Behind her, she heard him scrambling out from under the van, the sound of hands and knees on gravel, fast and frantic, like an animal. Then the banging started. He was at the door, hitting it with his fists, his open palms, his whole body. The van rocked with each impact. And his face, she caught a glimpse of it through the window as she lunged for the ignition, had completely changed. The fake smile was gone. The pretense was gone. What was underneath was something feral. His eyes were wild, his jaw was clenched, his whole body was twitching and jerking in these sharp, uncontrolled spasms. She told me it looked like rabies. Like whatever had been holding him together, whatever performance he'd been putting on, had shattered, and what was left was pure animal violence. The engine started. She threw the van into reverse and hit the gas. The van lurched backward, branches scraping the sides, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching. The man grabbed the side mirror. She could see his hand, white-knuckled, gripping it as the van dragged him along the narrow trail. She didn't slow down. She couldn't. The van bounced and slammed over the rough ground, and somewhere in those first terrible seconds, his grip broke and he fell away. But the trail was 5 minutes long, and the van couldn't go fast on it. 3 times, 3 separate times, she heard him catching up, heard his hands slapping the metal, heard him trying to find a grip, trying to get onto the back, trying to wrench open the rear door while the van was moving. Each time, the rough ground threw him off. Each time, he fell behind for a few seconds before she'd hear him again, closer. It was about halfway down the trail when she finally pulled enough distance to not hear him anymore. And then she was back on the road, the terrible unpaved forest road, and she drove. She drove for 2 hours without stopping once, didn't look in the mirrors, didn't slow down, didn't breathe normally until she saw the lights of a small town glowing on the horizon like a promise. She pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there until morning. She didn't sleep, couldn't close her eyes without seeing his face under the van, those unblinking eyes staring back at her from the dirt. She called the police the next morning and reported everything. They took the report, but she could tell from their tone that they weren't hopeful. A man with no last name in a forest with no specific address, on a trail that wasn't on any map. There wasn't much to go on. They never found him. As far as she knows, no one ever went back to that specific spot. No one ever identified the man. No one ever explained what he was doing out there in the dark, alone, under her van, waiting. Sophie doesn't camp anymore. She sold the idea of the open road and nature and freedom right there in that gas station parking lot and never looked back. But what she can't sell, what she can't let go of, is the not knowing. Was he living out there in the forest? Was he following her before she even found that trail? Did he watch her drive in and position himself before she even turned off the engine? Or was it random? Was she just unlucky enough to stumble into whatever he was? She told me once that the worst part isn't a memory of his face or the sound of his fists on the metal. The worst part is knowing that trail is still there. That clearing is still there. That tiny dead end in the middle of nowhere where no one would hear you scream and no one would come looking for days. It's still there, and whatever was waiting in that darkness might be too. Sleep well, everyone. And if your gut ever tells you to leave a place, listen to it. Don't argue with it. Don't tell yourself you're overreacting. Just go. Sophie almost didn't, and she still has nightmares about what would have happened if that van door hadn't locked in time. I'll see you in the next one.